Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack. Back in to talk about my thoughts for the healer's hero talents at the moment as they stand, and what better way to talk about how they feel than a good old tier list. This is just my opinions for what actually feels fun to play, embodies a good fantasy for the spec, kind of delivers on what their overall design and the idea was, and then, of course, how does it feel to actually play with it? I don't really care what the numbers are looking like for these hero talents at the moment, if they do tons of damage or healing or whatever, because they're just going to adjust numbers anyway. It's alpha, right? What I'm talking about is what's going to feel fun and interesting to play. And it'll be starting it off with, of course, Voidweaver Disc Priest. And the reason I think that it is at the top, and I actually don't think there's any other hero talent that comes as high, is how it works fantasy into actually updating the spec in like a meaningful, interesting way for Disc Priest. The Voidweaver tree actually rolls more power into abilities you're already utilizing, so like new players coming back to it aren't going to be overwhelmed. It also is a really good successor to missing out on your tier set from Season 3 and Season 4 of Dragonflight, in that you're not having as much of a buff in Shadow Covenant, but with Voidweaver, you're also having more meaningful buffs and more powerful buffs of Shadow Covenant, because it just sort of synergizes with the overall tree. It turns your light spell Smite into a Void Ray that you're blasting into enemies, while still preserving the functionality of how Smite's supposed to work with the rest of the kit. It does a great job of actually giving you a little bit of utility in a dungeon environment with near perma slow that you can then affix to specific enemies to help your tank with kiting. And I like that they've been making little changes to the effects and the actual visual effects that we're seeing, both for the Void Rift itself, but also for when it collapses. And they've changed it from spewing out all of this like really tertiary damage at the very end of its duration with the penance bolts, and now make it one large explosion that you can count on happening at a very specific time. And that, of course, is just fantastic for Disc Priest, so they know when the damage is coming. There is some issue, of course, with some of the timing for it, where we want it to maybe pop a little bit earlier in a raid, but we don't mind having it pop a little bit later in keys. That is not the best, and I'm sure that's something that they need to figure out, or we might just need to be able to play around. But the overall fantasy and what it embodies for a Shadow Disc hybrid feels absolutely fantastic. The A tier hero talents are all based on good fantasy, but not quite having as nice of synergy, or kind of missing a little bit of something here and there when the interaction comes between the hero talents and the spec talents. Next up, we've got Conduit of the Celestials Mistweaver Monk. This one is really close to Disc, but of course I think Disc is the only in the S tier. Conduit of the Celestials is crazy fun, where you get a 1.5 minute cooldown where you're sort of pulsing damage and healing. And so again, you sort of have that hybrid flex of the different monk specs, but you're also channeling the powers of the Celestials to be able to assist you. You're putting out shields because of Nijao onto your entire party. You're getting some cooldown reduction to your primary abilities and things like Renewing Mist and Rising Sun Kicks. You can use them more. You're also just doing extra damage and extra healing thanks to the other Celestials in Xuen and Chi. So you have all of this sort of fantasy of bringing the August Celestials to your side to be able to aid you, and how it honestly plays in dungeons is that you have a little bit more proc gameplay and a bit of an elevation where it doesn't feel quite as samey all the time. When you're going out and putting out your hots and then going into a full fist sweeping profile in like a dungeon environment, you're sort of greeted by the enveloping mist procs that are going to be able to give you more shields to your allies. You're then able to feel an extra reward for getting lots of Rising Sun Kicks and Blackout Kicks off with the extra damage that Xuen is providing to you. And so you sort of have this entire profile that you're able to play around, plus watching for the cooldown reduction from Yulan, that when you actually put it into practice, you start feeling like the spec is more active and more things that you want to make sure you're keeping an eye on, because they're going to come back a little bit faster. It's a nice way of like accelerating the gameplay that the spec is exhibiting, but not adding a whole bunch of buttons to the equation. You get another cooldown, and so Monk is going to have a ridiculous amount of short cooldowns to be able to cycle between, but you still feel powerful even outside of those cooldowns. It feels like they do a good job of not making the spec too dependent on the cooldowns, and while Conduit of the Celestials is really highly tuned right now in alpha, I think once they kind of bring it down to a reasonable level, it's still going to feel powerful to play, but not feel like all your other output abilities, your base healing or something, feels weak because you don't have it up. One of the biggest attributes I look for with these hero talents is how easy they can be to understand and to get into. And our sponsor for this video also feels the same way about coding. Boot.dev does an amazing job of being able to teach you from start to finish both Python and Go's programming languages, and they do so by having their online self-paced RPG game, which teaches you how to code. They really believe, like a lot of players in WoW, that the best way to learn is by doing. And so from the very beginning, they're getting you into writing tons of code and doing an excellent job of being able to guide your progression along the way. They also do a great job of tracking that progression with XP, levels, achievements, and leaderboards that you can compare yourself to others across the globe as you're continuing on your journey and learning. If you're ever struggling to understand any sort of concept, they have Boots, the powerful AI bear wizard that's been trained on each of the lessons and can walk you through your issues. It's an AI that will ask you questions to help you understand rather than hand you those answers. Boot.dev is so confident in their product that they offer a 30-day, no questions asked refund policy, and they let you try out each of the different modules with a free demo. So make sure to check out our link in the description. Use my code AutomaticJak to get 25% off your first month or your first year, depending on the subscription you choose. Thanks so much for Boot.dev for sponsoring this video. Now let's get back into it. The next up that I have, I'm a little bit at a crossroads for. Holy Paladin has been having an interesting journey throughout Dragonflight, and it seems like the War Within has some potential to improve things and sort of shore them up, because it's by far my least favorite healer in Dragonflight at the moment. Herald of the Sun, however, is incredibly fun to be able to play. Not only are you adding additional output to your allies in what feels like a meaningful way, it also captures the fantasy of a Holy Paladin so aligned with the light, it's just bursting out of them as you're placing these dawn light beams onto your allies when Wings is up, and so it adds another thematic sort of appeal to the spec at present. That being said, if this is a rating for how the entire spec feels as a whole, I might be a little harsher with Holy Paladin, as getting Eternal Flame back was a very big wish and very big desire for me. The spec itself, in general, just feels so bloated. While Conduit of the Celestials and the Mistweaver spec as a whole, they feel strong even when you're not in your cooldowns. They feel valuable. Holy Paladin just feels like you are dependent upon those cooldowns. And while I really love Herald of the Sun, I think that might just kind of continue pushing the issue unless they're starting to prune down some of the base spec tree. But that's a video for another time. Having Eternal Flame back, having very meaningful additional healing over time effects, and the synergy that is present by using, if you wanted to use Light of the Martyr, by putting just an Eternal Flame on yourself to eat up the negative absorb that hitting Holy Shocks above 70% would put you at, is really nice synergy, and Herald of the Sun feels absolutely fantastic to be able to play with. Not all icons are available for the hero talents, so this is Flameshaper Evoker, and I'm going to need you to trust me on this one. Flameshaper Evoker is super fun to be able to mess around with. You're able to put out your Dream Breaths and then sort of consume them early with this new ability called Engulf. It allows you to be able to consume those hots early, do a ton of healing to the target that you cast it on, because it's also dependent on how many healing over time effects that you have on that target. So if they have a lot of hots, if they have multiple reversions, multiple Dream Breaths, they're getting more prio healing, and they're also exploding for healing to everybody around them. So it's a great addition to the spec. It's one of the very rare buttons that's been added to healers throughout all this hero talent stuff, and it does a great job of sort of filling in a niche for evokers. They were kind of just missing some sort of heal effect, and so it's a merge really between Serenity for like a Holy Priest, but also a Sanctify. So the limitation is really the range, ironically enough, right? Range and proximity are again a priority for an evoker healer, right? Shocker. And so as long as you're casting the Engulf on a target that's also around other people, you're getting fantastic value. So huge fan of this. I wasn't sure how you could really result in like fire and healing, though it's something that like Alex Straza gets mentioned with a bunch, and I think they really nailed it on the head with this one. So huge fan of Flameshaper Evoker. For beats here, I like a lot of these for some of the fantasy that they provide, but they also have some like gameplay concerns that have been either annoying to deal with, or I think might be like the net neutral instead of like a net positive. The first one up is Lightsmith Paladin. And Lightsmith I actually enjoy a lot more than I thought I would. Lightsmith you actually are casting it on allies. You're casting a shield on a person. You're casting a sword on a person. And then that buff is also given to you as well. The shields feel really, really nice to be able to cast onto allies. It's an instant shield, and then it grows larger over time. It's super nice. It feels really meaningful to be able to cast that onto somebody. And of course, the weapons that you're tossing out, the swords, they feel like you're adding damage. It's easy to track and attribute to yourself, which feels pretty good. I would say the biggest thing with Lightsmith right now is it feels almost like it's a damage spec, because there's some of the other hero talents that are baked into like increasing your judgment damage and causing it to do AoE. And obviously there's just the swords that you're giving to others. I don't really mind it as a Holy Pally setup, and it might even be like a preferred setup if you're focusing more on damage, or I wonder if they'd want to set that up, that you have a hero talent that does some damage and some healing, but you sacrifice a little bit of healing compared to Herald of the Sun to do it, or if they're going to make sure that the laser beams out of Herald Paladin feel really strong and high damaging, so both of them do damage and healing. Either way, I like the fantasy a lot more than I thought I would for Lightsmith Paladin. And while the spec issues still remain for Holy Paladin, I think they got a lot of work to do there. I think they did a really good job of capturing this sort of fantasy support for Paladins and actually making it feel meaningful in the process. I just don't really feel like there's much in there that makes healing overall feel that powerful in like a raid or something like that. It feels more individual, but that's also kind of the niche that Paladin has sort of inhabited for kind of a while. Next up, we've got Farseer Shaman. Now, this originally was kind of like my lowest rating hero talent as they were first starting to come out. And after getting to some time to play with it, it's grown on me a little bit. There's also a lot of familiarity I have with the images, the ancestors you're summoning, because it feels very much like a Holy Priest's divine image. And indeed, there's a lot of times where I'm like seeing the extra chain heals and I'm seeing the ancestor interacting with other people that I'm casting on, and I like how visual it is and how noticeable it is. Though the other sort of downside, and what has me rating it lower, is it kind of gets me worried about bloat in general. There's not actually any button presses that are forcing the bloat, although I don't really like it proccing off Unleash Life, especially if you're trying to play an M+. But the bloat I'm talking about is more that your output, your cake can only be, X size, right? You can only have this big of a circle whenever you're going in and doing keys. And the thing is, you can slice and dice your circle up into many different pieces. You can have 5 slices, 10 slices, whatever. But things like Farseer Shaman are kind of annoying because it's all this passive healing that doesn't actually get tied to your abilities. And so when they sort of draw up the entire cake of where Shaman's healing should be, they have this big slice that's just all passive healing that isn't anything that you're actively doing. And that's what I don't really like about Farseer Shaman. And it's one of the reasons I hope they don't make Divine Image too powerful, right? Because I want my base abilities to feel strong. And for a while, I've really wanted Cloudburst to feel strong for Shaman. And, it really, unfortunately, hasn't. So that's what I'm kind of worried about in the whole bloat situation. But I gotta admit, it's really cool being able to see the ancestors copying your mechanics. It's a lot more visually pleasing, I think, when you see that they're hitting a healing surge or a chain heal, and you kind of know how they're directly interacting off your abilities. You don't quite have that sort of appeal or visual effect with Divine Image. You kind of just see like a light bolt or a fire bolt, and like that's about it. Next up, this also unfortunately doesn't have an icon. It's Master of Harmony Mistweaver Monk. This one is where you're storing vitality, you're storing output in your Thunder Focus Tea, and then you're kind of using it to unleash output. There are some talents that you can optimize to use this vitality on damage, and then there's some that are opting towards healing, and then there's some that are also, if you're not spending all the vitality over the duration, it'll just sort of spend it for you. This one was pretty neat to be able to play around. It almost felt like an old Well of Existence that we had out of BFA, which, now I'm saying it, I don't know if I should call it old or not, but it felt like you were actually storing the output to be able to spend later on. It wasn't quite as like visually stimulating as having like the Celestials coming to your side to be able to appeal to you, but it did feel like a more distinct, I guess, sub-play style, because there is a different buff you want to track, there is a different bit of gameplay that's sort of evolving, and I think both Mistweaver's subspecs with hero talents are actually getting a little more challenging. The skill cap going up a little bit higher, which is pretty natural as expansions go on. Personally, I've never been too big of a fan of like interacting with storing those healing resources and trying to spend them. At least with Well of Existence, it would sort of completely drain your bar unless somebody was above the threshold for health. This one feels kind of weird, and I don't know if it's just early alpha, but I feel kind of a disconnect in terms of like how much of my vitality am I spending by casting these abilities, and it doesn't feel as like clear and noticeable. But also having another buff to track with a weak aura or something like that, it does not sound overly appealing. Whereas Conduit the Celestials had like the power aura effects that are native to the game that just naturally sort of pop up that, hey, you have to go hit something. To finish up our B tier, we have Archon. Archon, we have a full video going over that, is basically causing your halos to reverberate and expand and contract multiple times, making it a little bit longer of a cooldown, increasing the healing that you're giving to your allies, and also making some of your major cooldowns in Apotheosis and Salvation a little bit more powerful with some healing increases. This feels kind of like just really focused on raids, although there is some M+ application to it. It feels all right to be able to mess around with in like a dungeon environment. I think I'm going to have a lot more fun with it when it comes to raiding, but it kind of just takes an ability which used to be incredibly powerful and then now makes it have pretty much all of the power, all the resources of the hero talent spec to make it stronger. So I like that I don't have to cast Halo as much because the cooldown's a little longer, and that I'm expanding and contracting with these Halo effects is pretty stimulating visually. It's also going to cause an explosion of numbers on your screen in like a 20 or 30 man raid. Though it's not really transforming any abilities, and the animations and sort of like fantasy doesn't really align with what their goals were when they sort of laid out like the flavor text. They talked about the flavor text of like receiving power from higher beings to become the best version of yourself. And there's not any sort of transformation. You're just sort of transforming one ability to do the same thing, but just do it more. And that's where I feel like it's just kind of mid. Again, like Lightsmith on one hand does a really good job of sort of capturing the fantasy and doing so in a way that adds a little element to the gameplay. Whereas with Archon, I don't feel like my gameplay is really evolving or elevating too much. I'm pretty much just stacking the Halo burst effect with like a raid cooldown or something like that to benefit from increased HPS. Feels all right, but I think they really missed the mark when, and I think that they really should change like the flavor text of Archon to better match what the actual talents make it to be. For our C tier, we have some that either do have some fantasy but don't really have any sort of impact on gameplay, or some kind of combination that we have there. First up, we've got Wildstalker Druid. Wildstalker, I really, and both the hero talents for Resto Druid, I'll say, don't actually really feel like I'm doing much else, to be honest. In fact, I'll just put Keeper of the Grove right next to it, because both of them start increasing your gameplay really just in the healing breakdown is what it feels like. Having the vines getting added into like Wildstalker, and you're saying, oh, I have these little symbiotes, oh, I have these little bleeds on hand, and they kind of just expand and spread and do these things on their own. I don't actually feel too much of a connection with, yes, I'm a Wildstalker Druid and I'm doing this. You sort of just end up seeing it on the breakdowns, and you are incentivized to go play in certain ways, which you kind of were already. And I know people have talked about not having like Boomkin form as Resto. We'll see how that goes. But it feels a little strange that I just don't have that sort of connection between I am this sub-spec of Druid. Keeper of the Grove, I know people have talked about how it's going to edit like their raid gameplay and how they're like storing treants to be able to deploy and maximize their output to be a little burstier. And once again, especially in a dungeon environment, I didn't feel too big of a connection to say, I have all these treants and I feel so powerful, because maybe it was some of the dungeon tuning where things were not really that high of heal checks that we experienced. But overall, I felt like even when I was doing live keys and doing my Resto Druid like 0 to hero challenge, I'm like, oh, I'll deploy treants. Okay, I'm not really healing with them. I'm just going to go do damage, you know? Neither of the specs for Resto Druid felt overly flashy, overly like I was benefiting heavily in some sort of way. So I wish they would kind of add something at least a bit more visually stimulating, the way that they did with like Voidweaver, to be able to let you know that something big is happening as a result of you making these decisions. In the middle of C tier, I'd also put Chronowarden. While Chronowarden's gameplay has, no problems or anything like that, it's simply just kind of a different way of like setting up your output to benefit from some of the intellect gains you're getting for hitting longer cooldowns, how you're going to enhance like your raid ramps, or how you're using stasis because you're going to get more powerful healing over time effects thanks to the addition of them on Spirit Bloom. Those things are great. and the warp feels, I guess, a little bit better. I feel like I kind of activate the ability and then land at my location at about the same time. I'm just not like moving through the air, so I guess I can dodge some cutter beams, I suppose. I just don't really feel that different. I don't think there's anything that makes me feel like I am a Chronowarden of, you know, time or something along those lines. It just sort of changes which buttons that you push, and that's about it. There's not any sort of negative effect about it, but I don't think for these visually stimulating, interesting subspecs, Chronowarden messes with too much in my calculus for when I'm going to be playing my Evoker. And finally, for our D tier, well, there's only one, and I think that we all know what it is. Oracle Priest is going to round out our D tier, and the D tier is basically for specs that I think have, you know, like negative additions to your gameplay. The big thing with Oracle is, if you haven't heard it already, you're cycling between buffs that you're casting onto yourself, whether they're overheal, protection, where it's redirecting it, and a healing increase, whether it's cooldown reduction to your next 3 abilities, or whether it's a single target healing taken received for these buffs. It just doesn't really add much into the equation, and it's more things that you need to track with weak auras, more things you need to watch to be able to cycle that don't actually feel like the juice is sort of worth the squeeze. I don't feel like I am peering into the future to be able to go resolve my problems and make it easier, especially when some of the buffs are around overheal protection, where there's just crazy amounts of overheal in this game right now with how healing is in general. So yeah, unless they're massively slowing down the game, which is another video in entirety, you know, Oracle just feels like you have one buff that you're playing around, and they're trying to make these incentives work to switch between the buffs and adjust between the buffs, and they just don't really feel that good to be able to work with. So I would say Oracle is probably in like the negative area. I think overall for this list, there's only one that's sort of like a net negative. I think stuff in the C tier is just kind of boring. I think B tier is like pretty good, but there's some issues or things that I'm not entirely pleased with. A and S tier I'm like thrilled with. I think that's really where it stands. Oracle just does not feel like the flavor text sort of gives you. It says, oh, hey, you're going to be able to look into the future to be able to do this, but it kind of is forcing you to just think more in the future about how you're using your abilities to be able to not waste globals trying to activate the Oracle Premonition at the correct time. You're thinking to yourself as you're ramping as a Disc Priest, as you're applying your atonements, when are you going to be able to roll over onto the overheal protection buff, the Velen's buff, let's say, while you're casting your abilities? Is it going to be after the Radiance cast? Is it going to be after the Evangelism cast? Is it going to be as you start doing damage? And you have to be mapping it out, and it changes all the time to be able to work with. It's not really feeling that beneficial to play off some of the cooldown reduction. And even if they did add a lot of cooldown reduction, it would feel really weird with the differences between Holy and Disc, where Disc has lots of really short cooldowns and things like Penance or Mind Blast, whereas Holy has minute-plus long cooldowns in their Holy Words that they want to be playing around the reduction for. Also not a fan of Grand Reveal, having to track the Prayer of Mending and Powered Shield heals for when you're getting another buff of Premonition and add that to your calculus. Just seems like it's incredibly irritating to play around. So I've said it till I'm blue in the face. My big hope is that they talk more about what they're going to change with Oracle and hopefully get the process started, but my hopes are really on like a season 2 of The War Within, because time is ticking for the expansion, and I don't know how much time they have to iterate on these hero talents further. So those are my thoughts on hero talents at the moment for healers, which are really fun to be able to play around, which might need some work, and Oracle Priest. If you're enjoying this video or have any questions, make sure you leave it down in the comments below. While again, alpha is alpha, there's the numbers really don't matter. It's more about how they're enhancing the gameplay and sort of the fun of it. And that is what this list is all about. It's all about which specs are feeling fun at the moment. Be sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and if you're enjoying this content and want to support it further, be sure to check out our Patreon or our live stream. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Hope you all enjoyed it, and I'll catch you all next time.